If you look at what happened between Washington and Ottawa overnight, it doesn't look like a negotiation. It doesn't look like a compromise. It looks like a declaration of war, not with missiles, not with soldiers, with money. For decades, the United States and Canada shared the most integrated economy on the planet. Two nations, one machine, seamless, efficient, quiet. But as of this morning, that machine is on fire. The administration didn't just impose tariffs. They went further than anyone expected. An executive order was signed invoking emergency economic powers against Canada, the country that has fought beside America in every major conflict since World War I, the country that took in stranded American passengers on 911, the country that shares the most complex supply chain relationship in the history of global commerce. They called them a national security threat. And Mark Carney's response? He didn't protest, he didn't beg, he didn't pick up the phone, he picked up a pen. And what he signed in the last 12 hours is going to reshape the global economy for a generation. The shockwaves are already rippling through Wall Street, through European markets, through energy futures, and straight into your bank account. Washington is raging, Congress is panicking, and most of the media is still talking about the wrong story. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what Carney just did, why the White House never saw it coming, and why the world you wake up in tomorrow is fundamentally different from the one you went to sleep in last night. So let's rewind the clock 72 hours and trace exactly how we got here. It started with silence, and that silence should have been a warning. After the initial tariff standoff, the one where Carney publicly rejected the ultimatum, the world expected fireworks. Cable news was camped outside the Canadian embassy. Reporters were refreshing social media every 30 seconds. Everyone was waiting for the next explosion. But nothing happened. For 3 full days, Ottawa went dark. No press conferences, no leaks, no statements. The Prime Minister's office said only that Canada is evaluating all available options. In Washington, they took the silence as surrender. Headlines ran that said, "Canada folds under pressure." A victory lap was posted, calling Carney a failed banker who learned his lesson. Senior officials briefed reporters that Canada had reached out privately to negotiate. That was a lie. Canada hadn't called anyone. They were building something, and nobody in Washington understood what it was until it was too late. At 6 a.m. Eastern yesterday morning, before the markets opened, before the first briefing of the day, Mark Carney held a press conference, but it wasn't in Ottawa. It was in Brussels, standing next to the President of the European Commission, and the Prime Minister of Japan appeared via live feed on a screen behind them. Carney announced 3 things simultaneously, and each one hit Washington like a freight train. Announcement number 1, the Canada-EU Emergency Economic Partnership. Not a trade deal, not a memorandum of understanding, a full emergency economic partnership with fast-tracked mutual recognition of standards, shared regulatory frameworks, and preferential market access. Because the groundwork had been laid for months, Carney had seen this coming. He had been preparing since the day he took office. While the administration was posting, Carney was negotiating. While the White House was celebrating, Ottawa was on encrypted calls with Brussels at 3 a.m. The agreement effectively gives Canadian manufacturers, farmers, and energy producers a back door into the European market. If the U.S. doesn't want Canadian goods, Europe does, and they just rolled out the red carpet. Receipt number 1. Within 90 minutes of the announcement, the euro-Canadian dollar pair moved more than it had in 6 months. European energy stocks surged. Canadian oil sands companies that had been hammered by tariff fears shot up 9% before lunch. The money moved before the politicians even understood what happened. Announcement number 2, the Pacific Corridor Energy Accord. This is the one that made the White House go pale. Canada announced a fast-tracked agreement with Japan and South Korea to redirect liquefied natural gas and heavy crude exports across the Pacific. They're accelerating pipeline and port construction on the British Columbia coast using emergency infrastructure powers. Carney invoked national economic security to bypass the environmental reviews that had been stalling these projects for a decade. Read that again. The man who ran the Bank of England, who lectured the world on climate finance, just bulldozed environmental regulations to build pipelines. Not because he doesn't care about the environment, because he understands that survival comes before ideology. He is telling the world and telling Washington very clearly that Canada will no longer be a captive supplier. The days of the US being Canada's only energy customer are over, and the timeline isn't 10 years, it's 18 months. Now, here's why this terrifies Washington. The entire U.S. energy strategy in the Midwest and Gulf Coast is built on the assumption that Canadian crude will always flow south. American refineries were literally engineered to process Canadian heavy crude. You can't just switch suppliers like changing a channel. Those refineries would need billions of dollars in retrofitting to handle lighter crude from the Middle East. Billions and years. Carney knows this. He knows those refineries are hostages. He doesn't have to cut off the oil today. He just has to prove that he can cut it off tomorrow. And yesterday, he proved it. Receipt number 2. U.S. refinery stocks dropped 6% across the board. Marathon Petroleum, Valero, Phillips 66, all of them fell off a cliff. Analysts at Goldman Sachs issued an emergency note to clients. The title was 2 words, supply risk. That is Wall Street code for we are not okay. Announcement number 3, and this is the one that nobody saw coming, the Digital Alliance. Carney announced that Canada is forming a joint digital infrastructure and AI development pact with the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Australia. Shared data standards, shared AI safety frameworks, mutual recognition of digital intellectual property, and here's the knife. The agreement specifically excludes the United States. Let me say that again. 5 major Western economies just created a technology alliance, and they left America out of it. This is unprecedented. This has never happened. The U.S. has been at the center of every major Western economic and technological framework since 1945, and in one morning, Mark Carney kicked them out of the room. Why does this matter? Because the next industrial revolution runs on data and AI. Whoever sets the standards controls the future. If these 5 economies align their regulations and the U.S. is on the outside, American tech companies face a nightmare. They'll have to comply with 2 separate regulatory universes. Their costs go up, their market access shrinks. Silicon Valley lobbyists were reportedly flooding Capitol Hill with phone calls by noon. Receipt number 3. The NASDAQ dropped 550 points yesterday, the worst single-day decline in 14 months. Meta, Google, Microsoft, all of them took significant hits, not because of anything wrong with their businesses, because the market suddenly realized that American tech dominance is not guaranteed. It's a privilege, and that privilege just got revoked by a Canadian in a dark suit reading from index cards in Brussels. So, let's talk about what's happening inside the White House right now, because from what we're hearing, it is chaos. Not strategic chaos, not controlled chaos, the kind of chaos where people are updating their resumes. The economic advisors are split into 2 camps. Camp 1 says, hit back harder, expand the tariffs, sanction Canadian banks, freeze Canadian assets, go full economic warfare. Camp 2 says, this is a catastrophe. They're saying Carney just outflanked us on every front, and we need to de-escalate immediately before the market losses become permanent. The problem is that the president isn't listening to either camp. He's listening to his gut, and his gut is telling him what it always tells him. Never back down, never apologize, double down, and attack. 14 posts in the last 12 hours. Calling Carney a puppet of European socialists, calling the EU agreement a joke that will collapse in a week, threatening to pull the US out of NATO again, suggesting sanctions on Canadian banks. The banking system that is consistently rated the most stable in the G7. The same banking system that survived 2008 without a single failure while American banks were collapsing like dominoes. But here's what isn't happening. The phone isn't being picked up. An envoy isn't being sent. It's all fist and no handshake. And the world is watching. And the world is drawing conclusions. Let's talk about Mark Carney's strategy here, because it is genuinely brilliant. And I don't say that as a political endorsement. I say that as someone who studies power dynamics. Carney understood something fundamental that this administration doesn't. In the 21st century, economic power isn't about size, it's about connectivity. The United States is the largest economy in the world. That's true. But being the largest doesn't mean much if everyone else decides to route around you. Think of it like the internet. That's what Carney is building, a bypass. He's not trying to defeat the US. He's trying to make the US optional, and that is a far more dangerous threat than any tariff. This administration understands transactions. You give me this, I give you that. They do not understand networks. They don't understand that when you bully one node in a network, the other nodes reorganize. They find new paths. They build new connections. And once those new connections exist, they don't disappear when you stop bullying. They're permanent. Every trade deal Carney signs this week is a nail in the coffin of U.S. economic centrality. Not because any single deal replaces the U.S. market, but because collectively they prove that the U.S. market is not the only game in town. And once the world believes that, truly believes it, the leverage Washington has enjoyed for 80 years evaporates. This is what the White House doesn't understand. They think they're in a negotiation. They're not. They're in a restructuring. Carney isn't negotiating with the administration. He's negotiating with the future. And they aren't even in the room. Now, let me tell you why you should be scared. Not worried, scared. Because the consequences of this aren't theoretical. They're happening right now. If you live in Michigan, your state's economy is built on the auto supply chain that crosses the Canadian border. That supply chain is now under threat. Every day this continues, manufacturers are exploring alternatives. They're looking at Mexico. They're looking at overseas suppliers. Once those relationships form, the jobs don't come back when the tariffs end. They are gone forever. If you live in Minnesota or Wisconsin or North Dakota, your energy costs are about to become unpredictable. Canadian energy flowing south is what keeps your heating bills manageable and your factories competitive. If that flow gets redirected to the Pacific, even partially, you're competing with Japan and South Korea for the same barrel of oil. Your costs go up. Your competitiveness goes down. If you work in tech, the digital alliance Carney just built means your company now faces regulatory fragmentation. The compliance costs alone could wipe out margins for mid-sized tech firms. And for the big players, it means a world where American standards aren't the default anymore. That's not a trade inconvenience. That's an existential shift. If you have a 401k, look at it today. Then look at it again on Friday. The volatility we're seeing isn't a blip. It's the market repricing the entire concept of American economic leadership. 80 years of assumed dominance is being unwound in real time. And your retirement is caught in the gears. But beyond the economics, there's something deeper happening here. Something that should keep every American awake at night. The moral authority of the United States is collapsing, not because of enemies, because of choices. When your closest ally, the nation that literally shares your values, your language, your border, your blood, when that ally looks at you and says, "We can't trust you anymore," the rest of the world takes notes. Denmark is taking notes. Australia is taking notes. Every country that has ever relied on Washington's word is now running the same calculation. If they did this to Canada, what would they do to us? And the answer to that question is reshaping alliances, trade routes, and military partnerships across the globe as we speak. This isn't just about tariffs. This is about the architecture of the free world. And that architecture is cracking. So where does this end? I see two paths and no middle ground. Path 1, cooler heads prevail. Corporate America, led by the auto industry, the energy sector, and big tech, descends on Washington with a unified message. Stop this now! Republican governors in border states break their silence and publicly demand a resolution. The administration, facing collapsing poll numbers and market chaos, agrees to a face-saving summit. Carney, ever the technocrat, offers an off-ramp, a revised framework that gives them something they can call a victory while preserving Canada's sovereignty. The new trade deals with Europe and Asia stay in place, but the immediate crisis cools. This is the hopeful path. It requires something that has never been done before, to accept a draw. Path 2, the spiral. Retaliation against the EU agreement. Secondary sanctions on European companies that participate in the Canada Partnership. Europe retaliates against the US. Japan pulls back from US Treasury purchases. The dollar weakens. The global economy fractures into competing blocs. We enter a period of sustained deglobalization that makes the 2008 financial crisis look like a practice round. Nobody wins, everyone bleeds, and the liberal international order that kept the peace for 80 years finally dies. Not with a bang, but with a tariff. I think we're on path 1, but I thought that 3 days ago too. And then Carney went to Brussels. Here's what I know for certain. The relationship between the United States and Canada will never be the same. Even if this gets resolved tomorrow, the trust is broken. You can't unring that bell. Canada now knows that the US will treat it like an adversary when it's politically convenient, and Canada has now proven that it has options. That changes the calculus permanently. Carney didn't just stand up to Washington. He showed the world a blueprint for how a smaller country can fight back against a larger one without firing a shot. He used finance, diplomacy, and timing. He used connections that don't exist in the White House and skills that aren't understood there. He turned Canada's perceived weakness, its dependence on the US, into a strategic asset by proving that dependence runs both ways. The question now is whether Washington learns the lesson. Whether someone in that building looks at the smoking wreckage of American credibility and says, maybe we should stop treating our friends like enemies. I'm not optimistic, but I've been wrong before. What do you think? Is Carney saving Canada or gambling with the global economy? Is this administration defending American interests or destroying American alliances? And the biggest question of all, when the dust settles, which country will be stronger? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And subscribe if you haven't already, because the markets open in 14 hours, and what happens next could define the decade. This story isn't slowing down. Don't look away.